So just to conclude, the Darwinian mechanism by natural selection, in my view, doesn't really explain the assumption that we've come here today, which is that we all have reliable cognitive faculties that can produce true beliefs, based on what we've discussed. I think an interesting way of looking at it is, well, if you have the first principle, or the metaphysic that the divine exists, it makes sense of this assumption. And if that's the case, then we should not only praise the products of the human mind and praise the human mind, but praise the one who actually created the human mind, which is a form of worship. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
So that concludes the opening statements. We'll now give time for both of our speakers to have a bit of a discussion. Maybe I'll introduce a little bit of my own bias and try to maybe steer the conversation a little bit. But both of you kind of talked about maybe the limitations of logic. And the quote from Hoffman that you mentioned kind of talks about the limitations of Darwinism affecting our ability to develop enhanced logic. And you talked yourself about the limitations of logic and rationality. So how then do we ground our beliefs, or how do you present to people how we would ground our beliefs in a consistent logical way? Or do beliefs need to be grounded in a logical way? When you talk about wisdom, for instance, I don't pick on you, but I've heard you talk a lot. I haven't heard you talk enough.
That's fine. I don't like being picked on. It's good.
Yeah. But when you talk about that the concept of wisdom, is that logical enough to be considered like an objective truth?
Okay. Well, so I want to respond to both that and first of all, and what Hamza had to say. First of all, I want to compliment Hamza. That was a very philosophically sophisticated argument, and it has he's putting pieces together in an interesting, novel way. I'm not going to talk about the theism conclusion, or at least immediately. We want to come back to that. That's possible. I want to address the issue because and then that will allow me to actually address your question. So I'm going to try and do the two at the same time. I want to remind you that I don't equate rationality with logicality. And let me try and explain a bit more, because I think the issue here, at least part of what I see Hamza saying is and this is an important difficulty for naturalism in general, which is an issue of normativity, and so they're invoking the normativity of truth. If we have reliability because Hoffman doesn't deny that we have reliability for other things, it's just for the normativity of truth. So that's where the argument bites, and that's fair enough. Here's my response. It's interesting because I've already sort of been independently responding to Hoffman in certain ways. So the problem with the idea that we would have evolved to pursue truth is that would be bioeconomically expensive. As you said, we just don't have the resources. It would consume most of our cognitive processing. I think the thing I would say first in response to that is that's true for everything you try to do. If you try to play a game of chess and you try to, as I said when I was doing the probability, if you try to do all the calculations, that would overwhelm your computational resources. I don't think we evolved for truth. I think we evolved for adaptivity. Again, that's agreed upon. So here's what I want to say, that we don't operate according to one normativity, the normativity of truth. Well, a lot of my work is that there is another normativity that is just as important, that seriously limits the truth we pursue, which is relevance. We only pursue relevant information and truths that are relevant to us precisely because we have adapted not to seek all possible truths, not to derive all possible implications. You're not deriving all the logical possible implications of every statement I'm making here. If you tried to do it for even one of my statements, it would overwhelm you. So what you're doing consistently, reliably, is zeroing in out of all the possible implications, the ones that you consider most relevant. That's what I meant earlier about your adaptivity. Now here's where I think the argument changes. Once you say that we're arguing that we have evolved to seek relevant truths, and their relevance is precisely because of bioeconomic constraint, that it is no contradiction to say that we evolved to have reliable mechanisms for finding relevant truths. And as I then admitted, that explains both our capacity to find truths that we find relevant, and the fact, right, because a good Darwinian to explain both the successes and the failures, the pen is thumb and all that sort of thing, right? It also explains why so much of your cognition is very self-deceptive. Now, Hamza did not make this mistake, and I'm not attributing it to him. I just want to say this clarity. Saying that we have reliable mechanisms, we have an assumption of a reliable truth, does not quantify how many truths you have. Doesn't mean you have a lot. Doesn't have to mean you have a lot. We all assume we have a lot, and here's the thing. Empirically, that's false. So if you're trying to rely on the assumption, it's got to be like Hamza said, it has to be a transcendental assumption about the capacity, not your individual cognition, because most of your beliefs and most of my beliefs are false. That is a very reliable result. Okay, so what if all we have to have are what all the argument requires is a finite set of true beliefs, and that's already limited by the normativity of relevance realization? That's how I would respond to that. And now that brings me to this issue of wisdom, because wisdom, like understanding, is not the same thing as knowledge. Like, knowledge is being able to ascertain the truth of your propositions, if we're doing propositional knowledge. Understanding is being able to grasp the significance, the relevance of that knowledge. And it is very possible to have the first without having the second. And insofar as you are committed to a normativity of wisdom, as opposed to just knowledge, and notice that they're different, because knowledge is about overcoming ignorance, but wisdom is about overcoming foolishness, and ignorance and foolishness are not identical. Therefore, knowledge and wisdom are not identical. And insofar as you have a normativity of wisdom, that's one way I'm showing you that you have a normativity of relevance, not just a normativity of truth pursuit. So, now, what does that mean? First of all, I'm not here to try and trespass on the argument about the divine. There's important ways in which I think that's a conversation I would like to enter into. I talk a lot about the importance of the experience of sacredness. So that is not the intent of what I'm doing here. But what I'm trying to show is, I'm trying to show to you, I hope you take this in good spirit, friendliness, that I think it's possible to be a naturalist and respond to the normativity argument by showing that intelligence, and especially understanding and rationality, are not governed just by the normativity of truth, but governed precisely by the normativity of relevance, which is constituted by the very bioeconomic limitations. That's what my work, in fact, tries to argue and show. Constituted by the very bioeconomic limitations that are central to Hoffman and other people's argument. So in that case, I think it's possible. Now, what it does is it does two things. It again means that we have to open up the notion of rationality. And again, I'm trying to suggest that to you, that rationality is not, look, a wise person doesn't just get truth in a situation. The wise person has the more important skill of zeroing in on what's most relevant. That's why insight is such a central feature of wisdom, as opposed to inference. They can zero in on the relevant information when the less wise amongst us struggle. So I think, if you'll allow me, I think it's that we didn't evolve to generate theory. We evolved to cultivate wisdom. And then along the way, that gives us some skills of rationality for overcoming self-deception. And then we have used that, and not everything that we used evolved for that use. I know you're not saying that, that's clearly false. Right? Because lots of stuff, like you can do lots of things that you didn't evolve to do. Right? You wear clothes, you didn't evolve to wear clothes. Right? Okay, so the point there, what I'm trying to make is, if you say we evolved for like intelligence and then rationality and wisdom, in which relevance realization is being recursively improved throughout that continuum, then I think that's how I can respond to that. And now, how does that ground it? Because wisdom isn't just about your beliefs. It's not just about your propositional knowledge. Most of what makes you a cognitive agent is not your beliefs. Most of your behavior is not driven by your beliefs. When you came into this room, you're relying on your skills, your navigational skill. And these are the things that's very hard. You know what's really easy to give to a computer? Inferential manipulation. You know what's really hard to give to a computer? The ability to walk into this room and sit successfully on the chair. All that know-how. Propositions are knowing that something is the case, knowing that it's true or false, knowing that a cat is a mouse. But that's very different from knowing how to catch a ball, knowing how to kiss your beloved. Skills aren't true or false. They're not governed by a normativity of true or falseness. They're governed by a normativity of aptness. How well do they apply to the situation? So wisdom is not just about getting true beliefs, it's about having apt skills. Your perspectives. You have a normativity there. How do I know about this? Because it comes out in the work we do in virtual worlds. You know what people care about? The sense of presence. That sense of presence is the normativity of your perspectival knowing. The feeling of being connected in the right way. That's not a belief. It's not a belief. That's a way in which you inhabit your like you know what? You're watching a video game and it doesn't feel like you don't feel like you're there. Why do I know this is so crucial? Because I'm studying how scientists on Earth move the rovers around on Mars. And you know what they work for? They work for getting that sense of being on Mars. Because that ability to have that perspectival knowing then allows them to cultivate all the skills they need, and then on the basis of the presence and the aptness of their skills, then they can do the science of trying to figure out the true beliefs about Mars. What grounds the true beliefs are the powerful procedures that are then grounded in the situational awareness given by our perspective taking, which is ultimately grounded by the identities we're assuming in our bioeconomic constraints. So that's how you ground it. You don't try and ground it extra theoretically. You try and ground it by saying, and so this is what embodied cognitive science means. No, how you ground it, and this is what I think Hamza's pointed, you ground it in how do people actually do the science? That's what grounds it. What grounds it is, there's nothing in the propositional system that will ground it. I just accept that, right? But I think it's grounded in, right, the propositional is grounded in the procedural, which is grounded in the perspectival, which is grounded in the participatory. And like I say, that gives you a nesting of normativities. Truth for propositions, aptness for skills, presence for perspective, and for participation, that fundamental adaptive fittedness. Because if you're not fitted to your environment, whether or not it's true or false, all this other stuff isn't going to be possible for you. That's what we seem to be showing. Like I said in this case study, when you put human beings into a completely novel environment, which is a great test case, because then you get to see what's it like when human beings are in a completely novel environment, because you can watch them trying to build the science literally from the bottom up. And that's how I think you ground the science. So that's my answer.
Thank you, Professor.
Let's call me John.
John. Sorry. Thank you. So that was very interesting. I'm not going to pretend that I understood everything you said. We're going to explore more throughout the question and answers. The thing about relevant truths, I think it could be the case as well that we could have evolved to have what I want to call now relevant falsehoods, right? Which means that it could be...
That's good.
Exactly. So I don't see that as maybe an adequate response to save the naturalistic program. Because James Sage, he makes a really good point. I'd like to read it to you.
Sure.
He talks about basically that, unreliable cognitive faculties that produce false beliefs could have led to our survival, because we could have had cautious belief-forming processes that were false. For example, he says, an organism may hide because it believes falsely that a predator is nearby. Evolutionarily, it pays to have cautious belief-forming processes that over-detect dangerous predators, especially when false beliefs carry little cost. So when you talk about relevant truths, are you changing the meaning of truths here? Are you saying it's information or data or an attempt to understand reality that is fitness enhancing? Or it is the case that it is a representation of the actual state of affairs?
So let me try to show you what I mean. I think that the point you didn't seem to be challenging me. It's not saying the reliabilism argument is not saying we have lots of true beliefs.
Yes.
Okay. So what I'm saying is relevant when you're obtaining relevant information, to use the neutral term you proposed. I'm happy to do with that. It's going to be the case that, a lot of that's going to be false belief. I'm trying to show that a lot of this isn't even going to be beliefs, it's going to be apt skills, all that stuff. So there's a lot of stuff in here, and then some of that is going to be true. And here's how I respond to that argument. That argument is a signal detection argument, right? It goes like this, right? So signal is information that is relevant to you adaptively, right? This is signal detection theory. Noise doesn't mean auditory noise, although it can be. This means information that's irrelevant to your survival. Is that okay?
Yep.
And so the argument that's being, and here's why I want to challenge the argument. So what we have to do is we have this. So let me give you an example, and it's the cautious one. Okay, so you're a gazelle, and there's a noise in the bush, and you need to know, is it a leopard? Because that's really bad, right? Or is it the wind? Now the problem that's facing you is the information's ambiguous, right? And so what you do, you have to do what's called setting the criteria, right? So this is, what I do is I set it here, which means I'm going to treat most noise as a signal, and I run away, and a lot of the times when I'm running away, there's no leopard, and that's a false belief. But it's adaptive, and here's why it's adaptive, because getting eaten by a leopard is way worse than running around a lot, because all that happens is the other gazelle's laughing, right? Now, the problem with that, in the presupposition in the quote is that that's always the case. But there's two types of errors. There's a miss, right, where you miss a signal that's there, or a mistake, right, where you take noise to be a signal when it isn't. Now, depending on the problem, sometimes this is more risky to you, but on other problems, this is more risky. There is no set place to set the criterion. Now, sometimes, as she points out, it might be good to set the criterion. Oh, sorry, she proposes very cautious. Set the criterion very high, because the misses are very expensive. But when the mistakes are very expensive, the exact same theory says you have to set the criterion very low. And then what you get is you're going to increase a lot of the truths that you're going to find. I just disagree with the assertion in there that you could be sort of comprehensively adaptive by having a permanently low set criterion.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. So I actually totally agree with that. That's I don't think that's the main issue with the kind of challenge to evolution reliabilism per se. It's just basically saying that, well, can we trace back our evolutionary history to show that natural selection, it was more likely that natural selection selected reliable cognitive faculties that produce relevant true beliefs over unreliable cognitive faculties that produce relevant false beliefs. Relevant in this case that they were adaptive, they were fitness enhancing. Right. That would be the problem. So all of this, for me, is great. I think it supports the kind of essence of the argument, and it basically says that we, generally speaking, if we're going to conclude anything, we'll have to be quite skeptical about many of our beliefs. But if we're to say that, yes, we adopt Darwinism as the mechanism to explain what makes us human, that's my point. So the reason I want to be authentic with you, because you are not a neo-atheist, of course, for sure.
I'm not an atheist.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm not an anti-theist.
Absolutely. So the reason why I think this is a very good discussion, because this is like a challenge to the Dawkins of the world, that they have like knowledge claims about religious beliefs, and they point the finger, and they're like, almost absolutist and evangelical about these ideas. And so are religious people too. Right. So there's those things both ways. I do appreciate that. But this, given the fact that they do adopt the Darwinian mechanism, sometimes in a non-scientific way, because they make it into this kind of, popular...
That I think is reprehensible. Yes, I agree.
Yes, absolutely. So the reason I try to develop the strategy to show them, well, if you're consistent with your...
But I like this, because then we don't interrupt each other.
Yeah,
it's like the conscience and Lord of the Flies.
So the argument here is if they're consistent with the propositions and the beliefs about certain things, the fact that the Darwinian mechanism explains, what makes us human, in this case, are reliable cognitive faculties that produce true beliefs, then the logical implication is that they have to adopt a form of skepticism, in my view, right? I don't agree with Stitch and Plantinga, especially Plantinga, who's the kind of the Christian philosopher that says, oh, this refutes, naturalism totally. I think they go too far.
Yeah.
The balanced view would be, I think, at least they should be logically consistent with their perspectives and say, well, we have to be skeptics, like in the true sense that there is no knowledge, and therefore that dampens the pointing of the finger at religious claims and stuff like that. And that's why what I get from you as well when you talk about wisdom is, well, it's about how you relate you said your state of being is very important. Like there's so many propositions that you could know to be true, but it doesn't necessarily change how you are. Like actually, no, from you, our discussion last year was phenomenal for me because I remembered a few things. Number one, you said to me, you said to the audience, and you're an educator, and that's the educators do that, and it was very profound. You said that in wisdom traditions, you can't be an autodidact.
That's right.
Yes, you need someone to take you through and help you navigate the
That's
space.
why I introduced that whole aspirational aspect of wisdom is crucial.
Good, I love that. Because that echoes our tradition true, and it shows a lot, because a lot of Muslims who aspire to be like, you know, scholars or intellectuals, if they learn just from the books, you could see it in the way they relate to themselves and other people, right? And I would argue, you know, I don't like using this word, but fundamentalism or extremism is as a result of a lot of autodidacts, because they don't have someone that navigates that wisdom tradition. So I love that. The other thing I got from you was, which I think was amazing, it was that your beliefs are not good predictors for your behaviors.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, which is good. I'm going to come to one of your classes. So the other thing was, which I think was very important, which relates to the Islamic tradition as well, which was that, you know, having information in an abstract way, there is a gap between what you know in kind of abstract information and who you become. So this is why, for me, when I talk about the Islamic tradition, I usually say that Islam is not a belief, because a belief in a philosophical sense can be very mundane, like this is a microphone. But rather, Islam or wisdom traditions, they are forms of knowing that transform what's here. Let's call it the spiritual heart, if you like. Transform what you say and how you relate to yourself and how you relate to others. Now, that shift in your state of being doesn't come through reading a book, understanding propositions, logic.
That's right.
Yeah, it comes through. Actually, why don't you tell us? So, you tell us.
Yeah, this is pretty deep.
What it comes through?
How do you change your state of being?
Well, first of all, I want to say something one of the things that Socrates was on about was exactly, he died for relevant truths. He rejected the sophists who just manipulated the relevance and the salience of information, but he also rejected the natural philosophers of the day, because although they could provide truths, those truths were in no way transformative. He rejects both because he said that what we actually need in order to become good and wise are relevant truths. So that's what and why does that come up? Because you can ask, well, when the Socratic tradition was a tradition, I think, that was directed to the very question you're asking. How do we go about changing who we are fundamentally? And that's a very interesting thing, because, like I said, and you seem to be agreeing with it, you can't infer your way through it. I want to give you an example of this from the work of L.A. Paul about transformation. She does a thought experiment, and we're using lots of thought experiments here, so I think that's legit for a discussion. She says, I've already given you a gist of an idea of what the perspectival and participatory knowing is, but I'll bring it out in this example as well. She says, your friends come to you and they give you really convincing evidence that they can do the following. Now, this is pretty close to Halloween, so this is okay. They say, we can turn you into a vampire. You say, so here's the question, should you do it? Well, here's the problem. You don't know what it's going to be like to be a vampire. You don't know until you become, but once you become it, then you're lost, because then you can't get back. Right? And you also don't know who you're going to be when you're a vampire. So there's going to be a change in your perspectival knowing, and there's going to be a change in your identity, because your preferences and values are going to be shifted, because you're going to be vampiric rather than you. So you don't know the values you're going to have, and you don't know the perspectives, right? So how do you decide? Because if you don't do it, you literally don't know what you're missing. And if you do it, you literally don't know what you're going to lose. And you say, oh, what? So what? Here's her point, because when she gave her the thought experiment, she says, this is the decision you face, right, whenever you're considering some kind of fundamental transformation. Are you going to have a child? You don't know what it's, you want to know what's going to change you? Have a child. You're going to be different, right? And you're about, like, well, I won't have a child because I don't want to be that other person. But you don't know what you're missing. If you do it, right here, your friends will tell you stuff that you don't know because you don't know what it's going to be like for you and who you're going to be once you have a child. Enter into a romantic relationship with someone. You know what's going to change you? Being in that romantic, you're going to be a different person, and it's going to be what it's going to be like to be you is going to be different after you enter. So you can't infer your way through it because you can't use decision theory because you don't have a stable set of probabilities, you don't have a stable set of utilities, you don't have a stable set of anything. And yet, almost all the important things we do, like the aspiration to wisdom, like the aspiration to rationality, require that transformation. Like, why did you come to school? Well, I want to become a different person than I am. But you don't know what you're going to be losing. You don't know what you're going to be missing if you don't come to school. So how do we go through it? Well, here's something that I think would be very welcome in your tradition. The way we do it is we do it by a form of symbolic play. Now, don't mishear my word play. I want you to hear it the way it's used in developmental psychology, not the way our culture has trivialized it to the pursuit of fun. I want you to hear serious play. It survives when we say things like playing music. I do Tai Chi Chuan. You don't do Tai Chi in the Chinese language, you play it. And it doesn't mean I'm doing something frivolous or for fun. I'm doing something really serious, but nevertheless, it's called play. Why? Now think about it. Let's go back to whether or not you're going to have a child. What do people do? Well, I sort of wondered this, and I got to talk to L.A. Paul directly. I said, look, and so I proposed an answer. She said, well, yeah, I think so. This is what I see people doing. They go out and get a dog. And then they do really kind of creepy things with the dog. They take pictures with the dog, and they put it in a bed, and they take it on vacations. Whoa, that's kind of weird. Or the advice that your friends might give you when you're considering getting into a relationship, they'll say, go on a trip with that person. Travel with them. What are they doing? Well, what they're doing is they're creating not a thought analog, they're creating an enacted analog where they put you in this place. Because what play does is it puts you in this place where you're getting enough of the, if you'll allow me this word, the taste of the world you want to get into and the taste of the person you might be, but you haven't fully committed, right? And then you still can withdraw here. And so what people do is they symbolically play, they enact. And it's becoming really profound that people who I would think would describe themselves as secular, in very secular countries, undertake this kind of thing. Let me give you an example. The Nordic countries, some of the most secular countries in the world, right? And then also some of the best places to live, according to sort of a Steven Pinker graph. I don't think he's right, but that's another thing. Okay, so what's becoming very popular there is a thing called Jeep form. So this is live action role playing. You go into a role playing situation, and instead of a dungeon master, there's a person who's a director, and they'll assign you, you're going to play the husband, and you're going to play the wife, and you've just discovered that she's unfaithful, and you're going to act this out. Now what the director is doing is changing roles around, giving you props, trying to get you into a jazz state of mind, because they're after this phenomena, bleed. What they want is that as you're playing this, the distinction between the play and what's happening in your real life, the line bleeds, so that the play gets infected by what is happening in your real life, so that you can do that tasting of how it might other be without yet having fully committed to it. I'm just trying to give you this example, that this is how human beings actually move in the way, because they can't do it inferentially. They seriously, symbolically, and actively play themselves. Now, I happen to think, and I mean this respectfully, I happen to think that a lot of sacred practice is serious play in that sense. That a lot of what goes on in what people, and again, I mean this respectfully, if you watch any of my videos, you know I was respectful of religious traditions. Right? But I think what's going on in worship, what I think is going on in a lot, for me, Tai Chi Chuan comes out of a spiritual tradition. I think that is that very kind of sacred play. I think there are a lot of, I'm not claiming all, I'm not trying to trespass on your theism, but I think a lot of the functionality of religion is the indispensable serious play that allows us to grow the wisdom and the rationality that we cannot infer our way into. That's how I think we do it.
Actually, just play off of that is that
Nice point.
like the Hajj rituals, the pilgrimage that we do, a lot of it, like you said, is completely symbolic, and it's meant to mimic what each person will do on the Day of Judgment. So the fact that you're crammed with so many different people in one location, because when we're resurrected, we're crammed in one location. All the men are wearing 2 pieces of shawl, just like the 2 pieces of shawl shrouds that we bury our dead in. So it's as if you've been resurrected from the grave, and you've got your shroud on, and you're crammed in one location, and you're all begging God for mercy, just like you would be.
Right.
So it's just that same idea. It's like it's being a play, and it's trying to prepare you spiritually for something that will happen.
I think what's very interesting with this is, I wasn't always Muslim. I became Muslim around 16 years ago. And I remember, just reading about the Islamic tradition and being like, inverted commas, right, intellectually convinced it's a God, he's one, X, Y, and Z. I think what was very important for me is I learned how to pray, the 5 daily prayers, before I became Muslim. And in a way, it was that kind of play, in a respectful sense, right?
Yeah.
And that created an awakening within me. So in the Islamic tradition, and this, can correlate to studies in the psychology of religion, in cognitive science, fine, they're not conclusive, but there's something there, where every human being has this natural state, this innate disposition. Within this innate disposition is a form of proto-knowledge, right, primary knowledge. In the Islamic tradition, we argue it is the knowledge that God is a reality and that He is worthy of extensive praise. Now, and there's other things like beauty, basic morality, but let's focus on the 2 essential elements here, which is that God is a reality and He's worthy of extensive praise. Now, what happens to the innate disposition, which is called the fitrah in Islam, based on various prophetic traditions, is that it gets clouded, right? It gets clouded because of parenting, like parents corrupt their children, right? Yeah. And society does. We have systemic effects for sure. If you've seen the Joker, you'll understand them, right? So it gets clouded. So what happens is that there are different things that can uncloud the innate disposition to awaken the truth within. So to change the state of being from the Islamic point of view is that thing which unclouds the innate disposition to awaken that truth within. And for many people, it could be different things. It could be trauma. Like trauma, in psychology, they talk about, the way to get transformation is through trauma or insights. Insight is very difficult, right? Trauma is easy because life's going to kick you in the mouth and it's going to be dark and you look for your teeth, yeah? So that's what life's going to do, and that's when there's a death in the family or an illness or humiliation or failure. These are sometimes blessings, and I don't mean that by belittling anyone's suffering, by the way, but they could be blessings when you look back. You say, oh my God, that creates such an awakening for me or a transformation in my state of being, meaning the way I relate to myself and other people. So from the Islamic paradigm point of view, maybe it wasn't the intellectual stuff 16 years ago that basically made me take that leap, if you like, or that transformation. It was actually through the practice. And I remember my friend telling me that, in the Islamic tradition, the closest you are to your Lord is in prostration, because the face is like the symbol of the ego, and God is almighty, He's high, He's perfect, with the most perfect names and attributes. He's maximally perfect, and His names and attributes have no deficiency or flaw. Human beings, in contrast, are nothing. There is not even a comparison. And that whole process of you worshipping the divine is basically, it was an awakening thing for me. So that's interesting, because for me, that created that type of an awakening for me to, maybe have a realization that for me, Islam was the way of life to follow. So this is all interesting stuff, man. Have you tried Qigong?
Oh yeah, I've been doing Qigong for decades.
Have you done hard Qigong?
I've done Iron Shirt, which
Oh, really?
Yeah, I've done Iron Shirt.
Okay, good. I have a question for you, right? So
I'm not an expert in Iron Shirt.
For sure. I used to do something called steel wire mantis, right? So steel wire mantis was, you'd have the northern and southern style of mantis, but they added steel wire because they incorporate Qigong. The Qigong, you have the soft side and the hard side. So I remember in one of my Qigong classes, you have the dantian, which is about 1 inch down, 2 inches in, and you get this kind of magnetic thing going on. I think this all could be explained naturalistically, for sure.
I have a paper coming out on a naturalistic explanation.
I want to see that, because I've been dying. I tell you why. Because I horse kicked someone in the stomach and they didn't budge, they didn't hurt them. You know what horse kick is, right?
Yeah.
It was designed To kick horses, or yeah, to take people off a horse and harm the horse, right? So I'm a heavy guy. I was like 90 kilos plus at that time, I think, yeah. And I horse kicked him, and he was like, as if nothing happened, right?
Yeah.
How can you just? I know your paper is coming out. Can you explain to everybody how on earth that works? And that's just for me because I've been in the martial art traditions since the age of 12 or something, and I really want to know how does hard qigong work?
Well, I don't know about hard qigong. I mean, I can tell you. So, like I said, I'm not an expert in that, and so the paper isn't on that specifically.
Just ask me to hold it down.
Hold the mic down. Thank you. It isn't about that specifically. It's about just a naturalistic explanation of the chi phenomena.
Yes.
So, like the things I'm interested in explaining are things like the 1-inch punch, how people can be one inch away and inflect it. So, and I sometimes do that on my students and things like that. And so when you measure that, putting all the mystique aside, and mystique is not the same thing as mysticism, but putting all the mystique aside, when we study it, the people that are highly trained in this can get up to 70% of a full body piston punch in a 1-inch punch. So it's not made up BS. It's a real thing. And then, well, how are they doing that? And so it's not an easy explanation, because if it was an easy explanation, human beings would have come upon it by now. So first of all, and this is also work I've published on. Do you guys know about the flow state? How many of you have heard of the flow state, getting into the zone? You athletes get into it. You get into it when you're sparring. It explains an otherwise bizarre phenomenon, rock climbing. Rock climbing sounds like something from Greek punishment, in ancient Greek mythology. You're going to climb up that rock face. It's going to hurt. You might fall to your death. And then once you get to the top, come back down. But why do human beings do it? Because it seems absolutely stupid from, sort of a hedonistic. They do it because it puts them into the flow state. So what is it like to be in the flow state? When you're in the zone, you feel it's optimal in two ways. First of all, people reliably, this is why they do the rock climbing, they reliably report this is one of the best experiences they have in their life. Have any of you ever had this, maybe dancing or fencing, anything like that? Some people? Sparring. You can get it playing jazz. I bet you didn't realize you were in it. How many of you have gotten into sort of the zone video gaming? Anybody? Because that's a reliable way of getting people into the flow state as well. Okay, so it's optimal in that people really like it, but it's also optimal in another way. People are at their very best. So when an athlete is got, you can see that moment. And athletes are constantly, like Jamie Wheels, stealing fire and some of the work I do. They're constantly trying to get into the flow state. You can see when an athlete gets into the flow state. Because what happens is, although you can tell metabolically they're putting in all kinds of effort, it seems effortless. It seems like, and when I get into the flow state, it's like, I can tell that my body is expending lots of energy, but it feels effortless. It's graceful. And go back to the original meaning of grace, gifted. Right? It's like suddenly something happens. Now, athletes and martial artists and jazz musicians and the top-notch video gamers try to get into the flow state precisely because that's when they're performing at their best. Because what you're doing in the flow state is you're basically getting you're getting your body and your mind to do a whole cascade of insight problem. It's like you're chaining a whole bunch of aha moments together, and you're really ramping up your intuitive ability to pick up on complex patterns. So, if you can get into the flow state, and that's what Taoism is, and that's what Tai Chi and Qigong are, like they're techniques, practices for reliably getting into the flow state. Now, if you get into the flow state, what happens? Well, you lose all this narrative stuff. You get the sense of time is now passing very differently. You have a tremendous, and this is why here's how predictive you find. And again, no lack of respect, but irrespective of your religious affiliation, how often you get into the flow state is predictive of how meaningful you will rate your life. It's an antidepressant, not a drug, but the more often you get in the flow state, the much less likely you are to become clinically depressed. Okay, so it's really, and here's the other thing, it's universal. Across cultures, religion, socioeconomic groups, genders, professional levels, people can get into the flow state. and they describe it almost identically. So that means it's very fundamental to how your cognition works. So, right? So it's optimizing your cognition, it's optimizing your connectivity, it's optimizing your performance. And if you get to, so remember I said you're playing Tai Chi? Imagine doing jazz, but not with an instrument, but with your body, so that you have that hyper-coordination mixed with innovation at all times, like a jazz musician. A jazz musician has to be terrifically proficient in playing. You can't just fake it. You have to be really, really proficient first, but also, to be good jazz, you also are constantly innovative. So if you're in a flow state, you're high proficiency, high innovation, and you're embodying that in a kind of hyper-coordination in your body. And that's where the power comes from. There's like what you find is that all of the muscles, not just the large piston muscles, the small control muscles, the feedback loop from the nervous system to the brain, the feedback loop within the brain between the cerebellum and the frontal cortex, these are all being optimized, sufficient, and then when somebody hits you with Qi, you feel it, because all of these muscles, all of these processes have been hyper-coordinated. That's what Qi is.
Thank you.
I don't know what it has to do with the rest of what we're talking about, but
I think it's time to open up for Q&A, although that was great because you basically told everyone if you don't have khushua, you're going to get depressed. So, khushua is our term for basically being in that zone while you're praying.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So if you have any questions, I guess we'll just raise your hand.
You can have the microphone.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I guess this question for both of you. And sorry,
Babe, do we have another mic to pass to the people in the audience, or?
it's a small question to be honest, but
But it would be good if both the recording and the audience could hear the questions.